In this lesson, we will largely be in Genesis chapter 23, the first 20 verses, and we're going to be discussing the importance of living a life that proclaims your faith. Now, losing a spouse is never an easy thing, and the longer you're with your spouse, the harder it is. And so, man I knew named Weldon, as he watched his wife Clendell die, Weldon said to me, "I've had her for 60 years, but I'm not ready to give her up yet." And of course, he wasn't. Well, in Genesis chapter 23, Sarah, the wife of Abraham, dies. And Abraham and Sarah, if you do the math, they were likely married for more than a century. And so surely a part of Abraham died with Sarah. Let's begin to look at Genesis chapter 23, first two verses. Sarah lived 127 years. These were the years of the life of Sarah. So right there, if you consider the likelihood that Abraham and Sarah were married in their early 20s, which wouldn't be uncommon at all, then they were married for more than 100 years. And Sarah died in Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham went in to mourn for Sarah and to weep for her. Now, of course, there were no funeral directors in Abraham's time, and so it was up to Abraham to make burial arrangements. And he did this by purchasing a place of burial in the land of Canaan from one of the Hittites, Ephron the Hittite. And the Hittites were one of the people residing in the land of Canaan at this time. Beginning in verse 3, we read that Abraham rose up from before his dead and said to the Hittites, "I am a sojourner and foreigner among you. Give me property among you for a burying place, that I may bury my dead out of my sight." We go down to verse 17 and read that the field of Ephron in Machpelah, which was to the east of Mamre, the field with the cave that was in it, and all the trees that were in the field throughout its whole area, was made over to Abraham as a possession in the presence of the Hittites before all who went in at the gate of his city. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. The field and the cave that is in it were made over to Abraham as property for a burying place by the Hittites. Now, this may seem like a dry technical part of Scripture, but there are significant things that we should not skip over here. First thing we'll want to take note of is that Abraham's choice of a burial plot is unusual for a few reasons. First of all, Abraham evidently overpays for this burial place. Going back to verse 15 of Genesis 23, we read this. Ephron the Hittite, from whom Abraham bought the plot, said, "My Lord, listen to me. A piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead." Now, we don't really have a feel for how much 400 shekels of silver would be. It wouldn't sound like a whole lot to buy a field for $400. In fact, that would sound pretty cheap. But if we look at another part of the Bible, if we look at Jeremiah chapter 32, verse 9, we see a field being sold for a much lower price. Let's go now to Jeremiah chapter 32, and there in verse 9 we read the words of Jeremiah, and he says, "I bought the field at Anathoth from Hanamel my cousin, and I weighed out the money to him 17 shekels of silver." Now, 400 shekels versus 17 shekels, obviously that's a big price difference. Now, how similar would these two fields be? We don't really have a feel for that. We don't know if we're comparing apples to apples, but it certainly seems based on this comparison, like Abraham paid a lot for that field. And that's also interesting in light of the fact that presumably Abraham could have buried Sarah back in his homeland of Ur in his family burial place free of charge. It's also interesting to consider the fact that people wanted to be buried at home with family in this time and place, and the Bible sets that precedent and makes it clear. Before Jacob died, Abraham had a son Isaac, and Isaac had two sons, Jacob and Esau. Well, Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, he and his sons left Canaan, and they went to the land of Egypt to join Joseph, who was second in command there, second only to Pharaoh during a very severe famine. But while Jacob and his boys were there, before Jacob died, he gave his sons very clear instructions to bury him back home in Canaan. As a matter of fact, Genesis chapter 49. Let's go there now. Genesis chapter 49, beginning in verse 29. Then Jacob commanded them, being his sons, and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my father in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, with which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. So you can see a whole lot of family all buried in the same place, because it was a big deal to be buried with family. And later on, when Joseph, Jacob's son, was about to die, he gave his kin very similar instructions. You make sure that my body is carried back home and buried in my homeland. Genesis chapter 50. Genesis chapter 50, beginning in verse 24, Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall surely carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. And remarkably, though, 400 years would pass or around about 400 years, before the Israelites would leave Egypt and go back to Canaan, Moses would honor Joseph's wishes. In Exodus 13:19, we find out that Moses took the bones of Joseph with him as the Israelites were leaving Egypt in the Exodus. The people of Ur, consider this, the people of Ur being in Mesopotamia, where Abraham would have come from originally, where Abraham would have spent the first 75 years of his life. The people of Ur would have believed that in their pagan religion and their pagan beliefs, they would have believed that to die and be buried away from the home of their fathers was to give up the afterlife. So we have to ask then, why did Abraham bury Sarah in the land of Canaan and not at home with his family, with her family, back in the land of Ur? And here is a plausible explanation, I believe, that I would put forward to you. And it's this, that Abraham is showing his belief in the one true God's promise to give the land of Canaan to Abraham's descendants, who will be as numerous as the sands on the seashore. That's an event Abraham knows he's not going to see while he's alive. But Abraham seems to be claiming, by burying Sarah in the land of Canaan, he seems to be claiming Canaan as his homeland. And so Abraham's actions, they speak very loudly. And if you look carefully, I believe they're saying, God, I believe you. God, I trust you to keep your promises. Now, you cannot keep from communicating. I don't care how closely you hold your cards up to your chest. I don't care how good your poker face is. I don't care how much you try to hold your peace. Intentionally or unintentionally, your actions will proclaim what you believe to those around you sooner or later. What's inside you, bottom line, what's inside you can't keep from coming out at some point. And Jesus said this, Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, beginning in verse 15. Jesus said, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles?" Doesn't matter what kind of sheepskin you wear on the outside, eventually the fruit is going to come out. Eventually what's underneath will be apparent. So we have to ask ourselves, we have to look and apply the lesson to ourselves. What kind of fruit are we bearing? What kind of messages are we sending out? Abraham, he sent out a message 4,000 years ago, and we're getting it tonight. We're getting it right now. If the God of the Bible isn't real, Abraham's life doesn't make any sense. If the God of the Bible isn't real, then Abraham's actions are foolish. If the God of the Bible is simply fictional, then Abraham, he should have stayed in Ur of the Chaldeans. He was very likely prosperous and well established there. He probably had a good reputation. And so, those things being true, it would have been silly for Abraham to leave. Pack up his belongings and leave not knowing where he's going, living the rest of his life as a tent dweller. Why would he do that? Abraham's actions only make sense if God is real and God will keep his promises. So let's be like Abraham. Let's live lives, let's take actions, let's make decisions that proclaim our trust in God. Let's be more than Sunday morning Christians. Let's live lives that only make sense if God's promises are true. Now, I'll grant you that if we live that way, we are going to be oddballs. If we are the same person all the time, if we are a Christian, if we behave like a Christian just as much at work and out in recreational activities, just as much as we would when we were in the church building, we're going to be oddballs. We're going to be different. We're going to be unique. We're going to be distinct. People might call us weird. They might call us square. They might call us repressed. But the Bible has a word for that, and it's not weird. The Bible word for that is holy. It's set apart from the crowd. It's different in a good way, different as God is different. And as a matter of fact, Jesus says we ought to stick out like a sore thumb. Jesus says we should live lives that shine brightly in the world. Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, beginning in verse 14, Jesus says to his followers, he says, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Paul, the apostle, he said we're to be pitied above all people if we aren't going to receive our promised land, not in Canaan, but in heaven. 1 Corinthians 15:19, Paul said that if in this life only we have hoped in Christ, we are of all people most to be pitied. Because the life we are called to, taking up our cross and following Jesus, that life only makes sense if God is real and God's promises are true, and he will keep those promises. The apostles, they're a perfect example. They left good lives, they left steady jobs to suffer persecution and martyrdom. Their lives only make sense if God's promises are true, if Jesus really was the Son of God, and if he really rose from the dead, and if he's really going to, and only if he's really going to come back to take us home to heaven with him someday. to our promised land. So let's be like Abraham. Our actions, our decisions need to loudly proclaim our certainty that God will give us a promised land that we won't ever see in this life. And as a matter of fact, Paul specifically calls us to Abraham's faith. Galatians chapter 3. Galatians chapter 3, beginning in verse 6, Paul says, just as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, believed God enough to follow his lead and do what he said, know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. If you have the kind of faith that saves, if you have authentic faith, then your faith will affect your actions, and your faith will be evident from the decisions you make in the life that you live. Let's live lives that only make sense if we serve a God who is truly worthy of our trust.